example of manliness. Strong when needed, kind when needed. His end, struck down by the blood of the Hydra, seven-headed beast of excruciating poison, searing body, mind, love, self, knowing it would not end, and able, one last thing, he built a great pyre and threw himself upon it. Finally, mercifully, delivering his last labour. So goes the legend. So we'd pray for all heroes. So we pray for ours.
Barassi, oh, remarkable!
The super coach, Ron Barassi.
One of the greatest Australia's ever seen, and wherever he goes, success seems to follow him in football. He's got that magic touch.
I'm tough in my demands because I think the game is tough.
He knows every facet of grand final football, having participated in 8 as a player. He demands players follow his advice, or else.
Billy, look at that! Come on, Julie! Go and tell Jewel to chase, or he's off the ground. One of the two. Chase that opponent. Now, if you both think I'm set up, you're bloody right.
Don't get wound up out there by anybody.
You could have run and intercepted that first goal, and you probably don't even know what I'm talking about, do you? That's bloody right.
Healy off, Ellingworth on. Bloody weak as piss. How many kicks have you got? That's the answer to everything. Possessions. You give me possessions and I'll shut up.
If we're going to fail, we'll fail my way.
I'm extraordinarily proud of you, but I want you to make me the proudest coach in league history.
The other side went in the race, and finally the fellow said to St Peter, he said, I see you got Ron Barassi playing up there. And St Peter said, no. He said, that's God, he only thinks he's Ron Barassi.
There's no need for any more talk. There's time for action now.
Thinking of Hercules, read by John Wood. Good morning and welcome to the State Memorial Service for Ron Barassi. My name is Eddie Maguire and I'll be the Master of Ceremonies for today's service. Today's State Memorial is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders past and present and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here with us today. I would also like to acknowledge Ron's wife, Cheryl. His children, Sue, Ron, Richard, and grandchildren, Cassian and Natalia. Please welcome the Barassi family. And Ron's extended friends and family. Cheryl has asked me to say that she is so appreciative for everybody being here today, especially those who've travelled. I acknowledge too the dignitaries who join us today and pay their respects to Ron. Brigadier Robert Marsh, representing the Governor-General of Australia. Her Excellency Professor the Honourable Margaret Gardner, Governor of Victoria. The Honourable Jacinta Allen, Premier of Victoria. Mr Peter Khalil, representing the Prime Minister of Australia. Victorian Cabinet Ministers, former Governors, former Premiers, welcome everybody. And it is a welcome to the G, on a day where the forecast is, of course, 31 degrees. If it is to be, it is up to me. Ron Barassi's ethos rings true for a man who believed vehemently in the aspect of team, but in the knowledge that leadership, responsibility and self-discipline is required to inspire and manifest outcomes in deed, not just words. Barassi was a force of nature, as a player, as a coach, as a commentator, as a citizen, a visionary with an insatiable curiosity for life, a moral code that would not countenance turning away for standing up for what was right. For 70 years, the Barassi name was the biggest in this town. When I first entered the media, my news director at the time, setting the tone for run-down priority, said, if Ron Barassi's knocked over by a tram and World War III breaks out, tease the war and lead with Barassi. Yet for all his fame, his friends in later life on world trips could not believe just how often he was recognised in the most obscure places in the world. It was Ron Barassi who was the only one who didn't realise how big Ron Barassi was. He was charisma personified, the intense eyes and that Barassi sneer under the famous moustache, easily transforming into the great smile and the twinkle in his eye. Ron Barassi Sr. won the VFL premiership of 1940, his 58th game. 10 months later, he was killed as a rat of Tobruk. He was 27. Ron Jr. was 5. The Melbourne Football Club coterie vowed to look after young Ron and his mother, and it was here that one of the great anomalies of professional sport, but most loved, the father-son rule began. If it takes a village to raise a child, Ron Barassi was helped raised by a game, a code, Australian rules football, possibly the greatest investment the game ever made. Barassi never stopped repaying the favour. As its biggest name, its biggest coach, taking on clubs at their lowest and raising them to unknown heights, driving the evolution of the rules and the ideas, pushing the national competition, even taking it international with the Galahs tour of the US and Ireland, and of course the Irish experiment, all of which drove Aussie rules to rule Australia. As we'll hear this morning, Ron would give everything for a cause. At Melbourne, he was uncompromising as a player, inventing the ruck rover position. At Carlton, as a player coach, inspirational, and then the tactician that changed the game forever. At North Melbourne, show business came to the VFL. And then at Melbourne and in Sydney, as a beacon of hope, saving the oldest team in the competition amid breathing life into the newest. It's significant, of course, today that we're at the MCG, Ron's Theatre of Dreams. In there, in the old days, the Premiership Cup would be taken to the old bull ring, and Ron would stand atop the bar and sing, "It's a Grand Old Flag." But out here, he made his name. To me, it's so significant that Barassi played in the first grand final to have an attendance in excess of 100,000 people. The 1956 grand final beating Collingwood in front of a record 115,902 ahead of the Olympic Games. That he coached in front of the biggest crowd ever here for a sporting event, 121,696, when Carlton performed the Barassi miracle, play on and handball, to beat Collingwood in 1970. And then he coached North Melbourne in the first ever televised grand final, the draw and subsequent win against Collingwood in 1977. The biggest grand final aggregate and most watched football game at that time. So it is a testament to the love we all have for Ron and how he transcended club rivalry, that for someone who tormented my beloved Magpies more than any person on the history of this earth, that I'm here today. Ironically, he was zoned to play for Collingwood before the father-son intervention. So welcome, everyone. Welcome as the state of Victoria, Ron's beloved Big V, commemorates and celebrates the life and life force of Ronald Dale Barassi. I'd like to now introduce Wurundjeri Woi Warring Elder and great friend, Auntie Di Kerr, to welcome us to country. Auntie Di.
Thank you. I honour my ancestors and my elders, and I pay homage to this sacred ground that we're on. I wish to acknowledge any elders of different nations, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and First Nations peoples from across the waters. And I acknowledge you all, and I pay my respects to your ancestors, elders and families. It's an honour and a privilege to be here today for this memorial, and Ron has been part of our family for a long time. Since the time when my sister was 4 years old and she was asked who she barracked for, and she said Ron Barassi. So Ron Barassi's been in our life forever, and what a man, eh? I'm so proud to have got to be in my journey of life, that I got to watch him and what he did for football. It's amazing. I hope that you surround Ron's family and wife, who I acknowledge after today, because it is a time after that they need support. It's very important they're looked after, and the football world stands up to do that. So I offer you all my hand in friendship so that we can journey together. May Bunjil, my Creator, surround you all and give you strength and resilience. Woman Jika, Warren Jerry Balak, Yuman Gundibik, and may Ron fly with the Creator and play his wonderful football ground in the sky. Nungodjan, thank you.
Thanks, Auntie Di. And please welcome now Narindri Jap Warang musician Amos Roach to perform Malu Puka, which translates to kangaroo dreaming. Amos said he would play something beautiful for Ron. Amos's father, Archie Roach, would be so proud. Thank you, Amos Roach. In World War II, this area was known as Camp Murphy. The Americans were stationed here ahead of the Pacific Campaign. As Ron was a legacy boy, it is appropriate that the Australian National Anthem will be performed by Corporal Fiona Wilkins of the Defence Force School of Music. Could you please be upstanding and remove your headwear?
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strain Southern Cross, we'll toil with hearts and hands to make this commonwealth of ours renown of all the lands. For those who come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. With courage let us all combine to advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
I get the feeling Ron's ready to run out again. Please welcome the Premier of Victoria, the Honourable Jacinta Allen.
Good morning. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge Wurundjeri Elder Auntie Di and thank her for the beautiful welcome to country she's just provided us. I also extend my respect to all elders and traditional owners here today and to those also watching online. I would also like to offer my sincere condolences to Cheryl, the Barassi family and all who loved Ron. I also acknowledge the many dignitaries and the loving fans who have joined us here today. Barassi the Messiah. He came, he saw, he will conquer. That was the banner the Sydney Swans burst through before their very first game under their brand new coach. It was 1993 and Ronald Dale Barassi had already conquered everything there was to achieve this side of the line named in his honour. The Barassi line, dividing regions where different forms of the code we all call footy dominate. Here in Victoria, where football is a religion, players are akin to gods, and the coaches who harness their talents become prophets, he was the ultimate divine being. Barassi the Messiah, who delivered the miracles through sheer bloody mindedness. There was nothing necessarily holy about his wins. Instead, Ron bent the world to his will. The game that gives us Victorians so much joy was recreated in his image. He was the face of footy. You could see the force running through the man, the pure determination. It was in everything he did and everything he set his mind to. It was in his sinews and muscles at full stretch, immortalised in the statue outside the G. It was in his poise and power, scoring on the run in the 1957 grand final despite a covering tackle pinning one arm to his body. It was in those unique Barassi encouraging words telling his team to kick it up the guts. It was in the stiff pointed finger he wagged at his players, giving them the halftime spray that changed many a game, demanding they do better, be better, reaching the high and exacting standards he set for himself. Today we remember a legend, but we also remember one of Victoria's favourite sons, a humble kid from Castlemaine named after his dad. And it was through tragic circumstances that he followed in his father's footsteps. When Ron Sr. was killed while serving in World War II, a group of Melbourne Football Club players and officials sent Ron's mother Eliza a letter. It reads, "Dear Mrs. Barassi, let it be known that the undersigned, the members of the Melbourne Football Club coterie, desire to place on record their appreciation for the sterling worth on and off the field of your late husband. His passing has been a great grief to his fellow players. We declare ourselves lifelong friends of yourself and your son Ron. We shall regard the material welfare of yourself and Ron our sacred duty." They held on to that promise and in doing so created the father-son rule, one of the enduring traditions of Australian rules football. Now, Ed did say earlier that that Ron was initially zoned to Collingwood. However, the zoning system of the day, as I'm advised, determined that Ron could have played for either Carlton or Collingwood. But Melbourne, having fulfilled their sacred duty of care and compassion, had all but raised Ron. They were taking care of their family. And in Norm Smith, Ron had a father figure who put him up in the bungalow in his backyard, guiding him through the challenges that come with a young man's rising star, with an arm around his shoulder, ensuring he kept a solid head on them. It could be argued that Ron inherited the clubman talents of his father, the hard-working qualities of his mother, but it was the values instilled in him by football that he in kind contributed and continued to demonstrate throughout his own life. Integrity, purpose, selflessness. They reflect how Ron played and how Ron lived. We'll rightly hear today much about Ron's unrivalled contribution to football. The stats, the flags, the titles, those come from behind victories. Ruck Rover in the Team of the Century, the inaugural inductee into the Australian Football Hall of Fame, and only one of 3 Australian footballers in the Sports Australia Hall of Fame. Today, I would also like to touch on the acts of kindness and care for his community that cemented Ron as a different sort of legend in the minds of many Victorians. The self-effacing bloke who, despite all his talents and accolades, never lost sight of where he came from or what mattered. His infectious energy and enthusiasm for life ensured he remained in Victorians' hearts long after he hung up his boots. He was named Melburnian of the Year in 2006 and Victorian of the Year in 2009, and he won awards for bravery after intervening in a street assault, all whilst he was in his 7th decade. That was Ron, always looking out for others, always caring for his community. Perhaps that's why so many Victorians have their own Ron Barassi story, for he touched so many lives in so many ways. Some of the stories we'll hear today will be the big ones, but it's also too the smaller, quieter ones away from the football field that also deserve to be told. For example, when Ron visiting his mum in the nursing home, but making sure everyone else there was feeling like he was there to see them too. Ron in a taxi queue at the airport, deftly mopping up a splash of baby vomit off a new parent's shoulder with his own hanky and with a knowing smile. Ron giving young kids all the time and energy and attention in the world, always willing to stop for a chat and for a joke. In the visible and invisible moments woven through all of Ron's interactions was a common thread: his natural ability to connect with others and his generosity of spirit. Ron Barassi will forever be one of Australian football's biggest ever names. But he didn't just teach us all how to kick and handball. He also taught us about how to live life as a team player, graciously, gratefully, and with gusto. His was a moustache that outlived trends, a passion that uplifted the uninspired, and a talent that will continue to transcend football generations. Barassi, the Messiah. And in his own words, if it is to be, it's up to me. Thank you, and Vale Ron Barassi.
Thank you, Premier. Great friend and former Chief of Army, retired Lieutenant General Rick Burr.
Ron Barassi had a profound influence on many people over the years, and we will hear those stories today. But one thing that had a profound impact on Ron was when his father was tragically killed at Tobruk in World War II. Ron was 5 years old, and it shaped him, his character, and his beliefs. Like it has for so many children of the fallen, Legacy stepped in to assist the young Ron Barassi and his mum Elsa. Ever grateful for the support and opportunities they provided, Ron remained an active ambassador for Legacy. And it was Ron's express wish for Legacy to be his nominated charity today, to assist families of veterans in need, just like he was at a critical time in his life. With Remembrance Day tomorrow, and in this centenary year of Legacy's continuous service to the families of veterans, this is greatly appreciated. Ron had a particular affinity for the World War II soldiers of his father's generation. Choosing to walk the Kokoda track to mark his 70th birthday showed respect for those diggers who came together under extreme adversity to beat the odds and defend our country so close to home. It also showed Ron's enduring determination to conquer new challenges, to keep moving forward, and to do it with mates who represented his diverse interests. Ron pulled together an eclectic group of 20 people to make this spiritual but physically demanding walk across Kokoda. I was fortunate to be one of them. Despite his broken body, none of us will forget his fierce determination and huge heart. The walk was tough, emotional and powerful, building an enduring bond amongst this group known as the Once Were Warriors. Led and unified by Ron, the group would go on and do other adventures, a mountain bike trek in Mongolia, rafting down the Snowy River, and finally the Hamilton Island yacht race. Courage, endurance, sacrifice, mateship. The words etched on the Isarava Memorial on Kokoda exemplify Ron's personal example and inspirational leadership. We are humbled to have been on his team and privileged to share this experience which meant so much to him. On their behalf and on behalf of all those who have served and sacrificed for our nation, as well as their families and those who support them, I say thank you and pay my deepest respects to the great Ronald Dale Barassi for his own example of service and sacrifice and for the legacy he left for each of us, lest we forget.
Thank you, Rick. To say a few words for the family, please welcome Ron Barassi III.
Hello, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Rick. I remember before the Kokoda track, Dad used to walk from St Kilda to Port Melbourne, and he'd walk through the water, and he'd also spend a lot of that journey walking on the bluestone brick wall along the foreshore, just so that he could get strong enough and fit enough to complete the journey on Kokoda, which was amazing because he was 70 years old. Anyway, okay. Okay. On behalf of Dad's wife Cheryl, my brother and sister Richard and Sue, Dad's grandchildren Natalia and Cassian, and Dad's longtime manager Rosemary, I would like to express our extreme gratitude for the support and kindness that all of you have shown during this sad time. It has truly been of great help. Thank you. My heart and soul are definitely with Melbourne now, but it wasn't always so. As a toddler in the 60s, I barracked for Melbourne. In the late 60s, I was a Carlton fan through and through. In the 70s, when Dad went to North, it took a year, but I eventually turned. In the 80s, I was barracking for Melbourne again. In the 90s, my allegiances moved north, interstate, and I became a Sydney fan. 4 teams in 4 decades. Some loyal supporter I was. Though upon reflection, I was never a single club person belonging to their tribe. My tribe was me, my brother and sister and mum. The chief was Dad, and he just happened to be a footy legend. Wherever the chief went, our little tribe followed. All these clubs, all these premierships, and all that time, I was really barracking for Dad. Footy was personal at a depth I didn't truly understand until Melbourne won the flag in 21. That history was in my blood. To many people, Dad was a legend and a hero. But to our tribe, Dad was, well, Dad. I was fortunate. When I was young, my time spent with Dad was usually while he was working. Although Dad said, always, that he never worked a day in his life. Saturday afternoon footy matches, Sunday morning training, and World of Sport. That was my usual weekend as a kid. Kicking the footy with Shimmer, Keka and Croswell in the nets before a game. Being in the room with the players for Dad's pre-game and half-time speeches. Running amok in the Channel 7 studios and leaving ice creams for Lou Richards to sit on as he did his segment. And of course, the sheer joy of a grand final win. Again and again and again and again. As a father, Dad could be tough. We grew up in the 60s on a new housing estate in Heathmont, then an outer suburb of Melbourne. There were kids everywhere and we were all feral back then. One time I was involved in a fight with an older boy and I was getting soundly beaten. After another whack, I sat down on the grass and started to cry. I knew I was beat. Unbeknownst to me, looking out from our lounge room window, which overlooked the street below, Dad had witnessed the whole thing. He came storming out onto the veranda and screamed, "Get up and fight!" He had that fierce, angry look on his face, one that many of his players have witnessed over the years while listening to his three-quarter time speeches. That look freaked me out, and I threw myself back into the fight. I got knocked down again, of course. It wouldn't matter what the game was or the situation, Dad would never give up. Dad loved a challenge, any challenge. Our family would often spend time during summer at Norm and Marge Smith's house down in Rosebud. When I was about 11, Dad and I were down at the Foreshore car park, holding a tennis ball on our way to the beach. Dad asked, "Do you think I can hit that pole over there?" "No way," I said. The pole in question, a typical road sign pole about 2 inches wide, was about 25 metres away. He stopped walking and centred himself. He seemed to focus so deeply you could almost hear it. He let fly and, needless to say, hit the pole. It's part of the rite of passage of a son to test their mettle against their father. Of course, I missed the pole. Have you ever tried to beat Ron Barassi at anything? Together we played serious tennis and table tennis, snooker and pool. Winning or losing didn't matter, but the competition was always serious. We liked it that way. Our favourite pastime was chess. Dad taught me when I was 8. He found it difficult to play without a challenge, so while I was learning, he would play without his queen. I remember being thrilled when I finally beat him. It had taken about 8 years. Chess was a game that suited him well. It was the combination of strategy and endless possibilities that Dad loved so much. When we played chess, the king would always die. Neither of us ever resigned. If one of us was getting beaten in a tight finish, they would then endeavour to play for a draw. Success with that would always bring howls of laughter. Long ago, Dad had a chance to play the then world champion, Russian Boris Spassky. Spassky offered Dad a draw early in the game. Dad said no and lost. He was more interested in having a go and doing his best than any bragging rights over a draw with a grandmaster. Dad lived an extraordinary life, but he had an extremely painful final year. He never complained though. Towards the end, Dad was still physically strong. A few weeks before he passed away, I was helping him to get out of a chair. He had about 40 kilograms on me, so it wasn't going to be easy. I placed my feet near his and held his hands. I started to pull, but got nowhere, because for no particular reason other than the man he was, he had decided it was a competition. And he started pulling me towards himself with a big smile on his face. Right to the very end, Dad was cheeky, loved a laugh, and had a magnificent sense of humour. Dad was a man who did not play it small. He intuitively knew that when we let our own light shine, we consciously give other people permission to do the same. Dad had the courage to do this, and he believed that we all could. He always put the clubs ahead of the individual and the game ahead of the clubs. He knew too that the game would be nothing like it is today without all of you, the supporters. He would thank you and only ask that whatever your pursuit, whatever your goal, that you give it your best. The air is full of courage, and all you need to do is take a deep breath and move forward. I'd like to stand here today not only as my father's son, but also my namesake, Ronald James Barassi, my grandfather, Dad's father. I'm sure Ron Sr. and Dad's mother, Elsa, would say to Dad, "Well done, we're proud of you." We are proud of you too, Dad, and I want to thank you for being true, fearless and courageous enough to be yourself and play out your own life. I love you, Dad. Thank you.
Please welcome the CEO of the Australian Football League, Andrew Dillon.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you, Ron. I speak today on behalf of the Australian Football League to honour Ron Barassi. Australian football is privileged to have a presence in every part of our country, with elite national leagues providing inspiration and aspiration for every young girl and boy. However, it hasn't always been this way. Footy, for much of our history, was community-based and divided amongst the states. There was no bigger plan beyond that, but Ron Barassi had a vision of what our game could be. A national league, the best from every part of Australia in the one competition. In the 50s and 60s, it was impossible to think that such a thing could happen. Ron declared the game needed it, and he pushed hard for it relentlessly over decades, returning to the theme over and over again, be it as a player, as a coach, or in his various media roles. But they weren't just words. He would demand of administrators to think bigger, constantly in their ear and pushing them. He put his own reputation on the line when the struggle in New South Wales was real. He went to the Swans to coach, and when footy in Sydney needed the biggest name of all to maintain a pulse. Always, he championed unlocking interest in the game in the north of Australia. The Barassi line was coined in his honour to supposedly divide Australia where footy did prosper and where footy didn't and couldn't prosper, and he wanted that line erased. He was fierce, determined and utterly driven. He was also curious, engaging and warm and always open for ideas. Ron Barassi seemed to have no realisation of just how famous he was. It was the game that was what mattered. His lifelong mission was to spread the joy of Australian football to everyone around the country, way beyond the Barassi line, and for that, our game will be forever grateful. Ron's a life member at 4 AFL clubs, Melbourne, Carlton, North Melbourne and the Swans. And he made a contribution to the game and to those clubs that was so significant that he was named one of the 12 inaugural legends of the Australian Football Hall of Fame. Ron is remembered by those he coached as a master tactician, innovator and motivator. Kevin Hall, who played in the 1968 and 1970 Carlton premierships that Ron coached, recalls not only Ron's famous speech and tactical moves at the half-time of the 1970 grand final, but also his lesser-known three-quarter time speech. Kev was one of the Carlton team members who felt anger at three-quarter time when Ron questioned the players' ability to overcome what was now a 17-point deficit, having clawed back from 44 points down at half-time. 5 years previous, Ron had read American Dale Carnegie's 1930s self-improvement book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He always knew that he would use Carnegie's chapter on reverse psychology at some stage of his coaching career. And that moment arose at the final break in 1970. Kev recalls that Ron said something along the lines of, "I don't give a stuff if you guys win or lose. You've just been magnificent today." It wasn't the spray they were expecting, and it had an immediate effect. The players were dumbfounded, then they were angry, and Ron didn't need to say another word. A famous victory followed. Sorry, Ed. Ron had an incredible ability to get the most out of individuals and teams. He was a hero for generations of football lovers, but the game was the hero for Ron, and he spent his life making sure everyone knew it. On behalf of football, we farewell Ronald Dale Barassi at the ground where he ruled. 6 premierships as a player, 4 premierships as a coach. No one has won more premierships at this ground. Farewell, Ron, and thank you for everything.
Ron Barassi is one of the supreme greats of Australian sport. Who else has a geographical divide named after him? I refer, of course, to the border between the Aussie rules-playing states of the south and the rugby-playing states of the north. I enjoyed my many discussions with him, particularly in terms of coach's intuition. He told me a story once of how his team in a grand final, Collingwood were leading by a big margin at half-time. He knew he had to make a change. The match committee said, no, leave the guy out there. But just as they were running out on the field, he replaced the guy with the one he wanted, told him to handball, and of course Carlton won by a significant margin. It's that sort of idea, the man who can change the course of a game by changing the rules. They're always the ones who are going to be considered the greats of their sport.
So Ron Barassi, he used to sign his name 17410, 17410. It meant that he competed in 17 grand finals, either as a player or as a coach, and won 10 of them. That'll never be equalled, you have to say. We knew Ron very differently. He was a family friend, he and Cheryl, for over 40 years. A beautiful man. I'd never heard him say anything bad about anyone, but you scratch just below the surface and he was a competitive mongrel. Unbelievable.
Now, courage and tenacity were great hallmarks of Ron Barassi. In 1962, he came across a car accident in Fitzroy. It was on fire. One of the cars was on fire. Ron jumped out of the car, charged across the road and dragged 3 men out of the car with the help of Bob Johnson, another player. One was on fire. Ron ripped his own shirt off, put the flames out and saved the lives of those 3 guys. Fast forward 47 years, a woman is bashed in the street in St Kilda. Ron doesn't even think or ask or say, what are you doing? He gets up and goes straight at the perpetrator and his mates. That's the courage and the mentality of Ronald Dale Barassi.
Ron Barassi is one of my all-time Australian sporting heroes. And what I love most about him was his passion, his want and will to make everyone around him better, and that he wanted to win. And I think if you've got those 3 characteristics as a sportsman, you're not going to go far wrong. As a young boy, I obviously idolised the impact that Ron Barassi had on my beloved North Melbourne Football Club. I was only a young lad, but to sit back and watch and listen to how motivating he was, to how much he wanted that team to have success, there's certainly a lot of the things that I carried over into my playing days as a player and as a captain and now as a coach. Ron will be sadly missed. Rest in peace, Ron Barassi.
Five of the greatest names who played and coached in football history: Jock McHale, Norm Smith, Ron Barassi, and our next 2 guests, Lee Matthews and Kevin Sheedy. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Eddie. Lee, let me come to you first, because Barassi was the generation ahead of you, and you actually watched him as a little boy on the telly.
Well, yes, I never played on the same field as Barassi. I think he played his last game in '69. I played my first game later in the year, but I just watched him as a little kid growing up, and he was Mr. Football. And that picture that we see occasionally when he's a big alpha male, big powerful man in the Carlton outfit, blue jumper, white shorts, and white bootlaces. And he used to say to us little kids, if you can't be a footballer, at least look like one.
Kevin? Yeah. What was your first impression of the great RDB?
Well, luckily TV came to Australia in '56. I was about 10 years of age, and that was the introduction to really Ron Barassi, because the people in those days never had a lot of cars, and we got to see him on the television, obviously, and he was just magnificent. He was sort of like, for a kid at 10 years of age, 9 years of age, he was like Spartacus or Ben-Hur, the 2 great movies that come around out in 1960s of that era. And but 4 years later, Kevin Bartlett, myself and another player called Kerry Ryan, we were invited down here in school holidays to be training with the great Brian Dixon and those sort of players, Keneally. So the thing that impressed me about the guy was that he was just such a fantastic build of a person, and we were two skinny little sticks rolling around, KB and myself, just dreaming that maybe, you never know, we could make it. And that Melbourne team that come through in that era, Keneally and Townsend and these sorts of blokes, Kenny Emsell and John Lord, they actually inspired a lot of young men that really wanted to make it in life, not just only football.
Lee, at Hawthorn, the battles against North Melbourne in the 70s against the Supercoach was something else.
They were legendary, yes. When I think, they played in 5 consecutive grand finals, and 3 of them were against Hawthorn, and the other 2 they knocked Hawthorn out in the preliminary final. So the main rivalry in the mid-70s with Brass. And when you look back on that vision, isn't it good that you didn't wear club uniforms back then? Would have been much more boring without that open neck, that striped shirt that he won the premiership in 77, yeah.
And Kevin, for you, you sort of took over from Brass with the thinking, the lateral thinking, the Dale Carnegie style of approach to football. How much of an inspiration was he to you in your thinking when you became a coach?
Yeah, well, he was. Tom Hafey was my coach, very straight down the line. You knew when you were going to play against Barassi as a player, particularly in the 70s when we were at 74 grand final. That always had you a little bit on edge as an opponent. And of course, I remember one day I was playing here at the MCG and I've got Barry Richardson, Colin Beard and myself. We're all in the goal square with John Nichols, Cesalenko and Sid Jackson. Nothing else ahead of us for about 100 metres. I've gone, that was very nerve-wracking. But he really made you think about what the other coach could do to you as a player. But on the adventurism of him, and I thought he's been sensational. And of course, probably one of the main reasons I ended up going up to the Giants was because of Barras and Robert Walls and Lee. We all ended up going north, made sure the game got to its fruitful self. And I think in the end, as a coach, he was inspirational in me having a look outside what my coach used to teach me, which is Hafey. We were the fittest team in it at Richmond, but and he said, look, if you've got to go overseas and chase knowledge. And he was brilliant at that, and that's what you learn from a person. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, we forget, we used to stop off at Werribee for a break on the way to Geelong. I mean, that's how bad we were. So if anybody needed a psychologist, I need one after looking back at that. But it was a different era, obviously, and we needed to have inspiration in the country, and definitely Ron inspired not only opponents, but people in general in life. And I think that's what our great country's about. We have many magnificent people in all sports, and our Olympic Games and the footballers and the cricketers obviously have been fantastic.
And you mentioned one in your answer there. The great Sid Jackson is here with us today. So welcome, Sid. He loved you, mate.
Super Sid. Guy. Great guy.
Thanks, Sid. You wouldn't believe, before we came on stage, I spoke to Cheryl, and Cheryl said to me that the first time she ever spoke about football to Ron, he said, now, Cheryl, I understand you don't know anything about the game. You couldn't draw a football. But he said there are 4 teams in the AFL, VFL history that start with F. And she said, right, OK. And he said, Footscray, Fitzroy, Fremantle and something Collingwood.
Flaming Collingwood.
We made him. What are you talking about? And I ask you this, Lee, because you coached against Barras in his last game for the Sydney Swans, of all people, who were coming out of nowhere, and they put us out of the finals again at Collingwood.
Yeah, it was amazing. And Barrass's last coaching year at Melbourne was 85. That was my last year as a player, so I never kind of coached against him, except when he went to Sydney and I was still coaching Collingwood. And yeah, the last game of 95, Collingwood had to win to play finals, and we lost. Barras, of course, was coaching the Swans in that few years that he went up north there when they were at a low ebb. So it ended up being my last game at Collingwood and his last coaching game ever at the Swans that particular day. Yeah.
he was a great man at pulling people together. Now, tell me about the Pisces lunch.
Yep. Well, the Pisces is, we discovered that in footy there's about 1 in every 12 people who are Pisces.
Is that right?
Strange, I don't know how that happened. But Ron was a Pisces and I was a Pisces, and there's about 12 or 14 of us that were Pisces. It started off maybe 6 or 8. Mike Sheehan, I think, started. Richard Collins from the Swans, probably. And Brass...
Can I give you some more names?
Yep.
Sam Kirkovich, Peter Hudson, Kevin Bartlett, Gerard Healy, Matthew Richard and Michael O'Loughlin. Not a bad lunch.
And a few others here, but we've only got a table of 14, so there's a limit.
Right, OK.
Unfortunately, we've probably got one spot now, so that's a nasty way of getting another spot. But no, so we actually used to meet once a year, and we hadn't seen Brass much in the COVID years, and we knew that the sort of dementia was... didn't see much in the last couple of years, but that was really great too. I spent a week with Brass game viewing in Adelaide in Africa in the mid-90s. There's a group going over and everyone else dropped off except me and Ron. So we went round Botswana. I think the Lions were a bit scared of Ron actually, because they'd leave you alone. But so that's where I got to know him a bit more personally than clearly just as an observer.
Imagine being the poor lion looking up and seeing Ron Barassi and Lee Matthews coming at you in the tundra.
Yes, yeah.
Sheeds, can I ask you, mate? We spoke about Ron last week, and you said you wanted to make one point about Ron Barassi that made him so special.
I thought it was mentioned that in his very early 70s, about 73, when he saved that young lady being really killed in Fitzroy Street, I thought that was that to me is a legend of a legend action, because he wasn't 50, he wasn't 40, he was 73, 74 years of age. And just to straight away go out and save that young lady from being beaten up by 6 ugly sort of men, that I think that to me is a character of the person really shining through. And obviously he's come through his club at Melbourne and the clubs he played and coached for. And I think that's why we all loved him and still do and still always will. And you could really see it shine out in his son, Ron, and then of course Richard, who I met before, 2 lovely young men. And I think that what a fantastic family they've been, obviously, to go through the hardship of losing a legendary father like this. But to see his son talk about him so well from the heart, I could have listened to him I told him outside, I could have listened to Ron Barassi Jr. for another hour on the way he spoke about his father.
Beautifully said, Kevin. Lee, to wrap up, a final thought on Ron Barassi.
Well, enormously successful player, enormously successful coach, like a real statesman of the game. He's been almost a scandal-free figurehead of the game. He was Mr. Football back in the 60s, with apologies to Ted Whitten, who he and Ron used to actually argue who was Mr.
Football. They would fight over who was Mr. and Mrs. Football.
Oh, it was a great relationship.
How about that?
But what we do know, there's still no other Mr. Football that surpasses Ron Barassi 60, 70 years later.
One little anecdote as we finish on the Mr. and Mrs. Football. At a State of Origin game, I think you were coaching, Kevin, I think we're in Adelaide, and Ron had a couple of reds at night and had gone to bed and woken up in the middle of the night and thought that he'd go to the bathroom, and unfortunately he opened up the wrong door and found himself out in the corridor. And the door shut behind him, and he was in the nick. And he quickly sobered up and thought, what do I do? So he banged on the door next door, and unfortunately for him, it was Ted Whitten's door. And Ted went to the door and opened it up with a chain and looked out and said, "Who's Mr. Football?" And Brett said, "Open the door, Ted." He said, "Who's Mr. Football and who's Mrs. Football?" And that was the great manly love they had for each other, and Skilts and Billy Goggin and all the team going over there, and Kevin Sheen and the likes. It was a wonderful time, and just so much of him. I couldn't think of 2 better people to speak on behalf of the legacy of the great Ron Barassi than these 2, Kevin Sheedy and Lee Matthews. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ed.
And ladies and gentlemen, while we all lay claim to a piece of Ron in our footballing lives, he will always be Melbourne's boy. Former club champion and Melbourne Cricket Club president Stephen Smith, and talks about what is the story of a Demon legend.
Barassi of Melbourne comes in to get the ball. He turns onto his left foot. Barassi handballs it out to the open space.
Jack Dyer once said about Ron Barassi that he was so deeply connected to the Melbourne Football Club that opposition players used to think he wasn't wearing a football jumper, that it was the colour of his skin.
Up they go. Barassi in there.
1 through the 7th.
Barassi crashes in, leaving bodies in his wake.
The Barassi in the forward pocket.
While Ron went on to create history at other clubs, the Melbourne Football Club was the enduring love of his life. It was connection born out of loss and love, belonging and brotherhood. He carried his father's name and wore his father's number, number 31.
I not only carry his name, I carry his blood.
That same football club famously made a pledge to regard the material welfare of 5-year-old Ronnie and his mother Elsa as their sacred duty after Ron Sr. was killed at Tobruk in 1941. They never forgot the pledge. In time, Ron came to live in a bungalow in the backyard of his coach, Norm Smith's house. Norm would become his mentor in football and in life, a father figure who inspired him and drove him in equal parts.
He was very, very good for me, both as a person and as a footballer, naturally. And he's been the greatest influence by far in my football career.
Ron found his place within the club, but initially couldn't find the right position within the team. That was until he was named ruck rover in his second season. He transformed the role, kick-starting his career. Ron became the driving force behind the most successful period of the Melbourne Football Club. After missing the finals in his first season, Barassi went on to play in 11 consecutive final series, including 7 grand finals in a row. Across his 12 seasons, Barassi and Melbourne would win an astonishing 6 premierships. He regularly produced his best when his best was needed. With teammates insisting he would have won 4 Norm Smith medals if the award named after his legendary coach had been around in the 50s. A highly skilled, tenacious player and inspirational on-field leader, Ron captained Melbourne in 1960 and 64 flags. His last on-field act in the red and blue came when he hoisted the 1964 Cup aloft as skipper.
Finish. What a game.
I'm sure today that we have seen one of the greatest spectacles of our Australian games ever played on this ground.
No one could have imagined then that it would be his final game for the club and Melbourne's last premiership for 57 seasons. Having already led North and Carlton to the ultimate success, he returned home as the prodigal son to coach Melbourne in 1981. The thing I loved about Barassi when he came to coach us was that he genuinely cared about the club. He had everything to lose and not much to gain. He was a super coach, and everyone expected him to turn us into a successful team. But the problem was we were an average list, and it didn't quite happen that way. By the end of his 5 years, he had reset the culture in the club and introduced a new standard of professionalism that was the base for the more successful Melbourne teams of the late 80s and 90s. While Melbourne shared Barassi with others along the way, in his heart and ours, he was always a demon. Thankfully, he was able to see his wish come true with another premiership in 2021. Barassi was the heart and soul of the Melbourne Football Club. He loved Melbourne, and we all loved him.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen Smith, legend of the Melbourne Football Club. Melbourne Football Club President, Kate Roffey.
Thank you, Eddie. Ronald Dale Barassi, Team of the Century, Hall of Fame legend, icon of our sport, but in his own words and most importantly to my club, a Melbourne man through and through. Above anything else, he wanted to play football for Melbourne, the club where his father Ron Sr. had played, and mountains were moved to make it so. You're correct, Premier. He was eligible to play for both Carlton and Collingwood, and I'm told on very good authority, Eddie, that he was relocated away from his mum to grow up with his grandparents, specifically so he would not have to play for Collingwood in particular. The Melbourne Football Club weren't happy enough with that. They advocated very strongly for the introduction of the new father-son rule to ensure Ron Jr., like his dad, would become a demon. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. That day in 1953, when Ron became a D, started the most extraordinary footballing career ever. Number 31, just like his dad. They say he played with unmatched tenacity, game-changing innovation, simple, sheer brilliance. 6 Melbourne premierships too as captain. 1964, and Captain Ron was our superhero. And then he went and broke every red and blue heart by joining Carlton as captain coach the following year. They could not believe it. Most had hoped he'd succeed Norm Smith, but he wanted there to be absolutely no question he was being gifted a coaching role as a Melbourne son. Ron said he wanted to see if I'm good enough to coach in my own right. Turns out he wasn't too bad. 17-4-10, the numbers synonymous with his signature. 17 grand finals, 4 clubs, 10 premierships. Extraordinary. Of course, you don't become an icon by what you do on the field alone. It's what you do beyond the white line that makes the difference. As Frank Bluey Adams wrote, forget for a minute what Barassi did and what he achieved on the field. Something just as important is the fact that he is an outstanding human being. Off the field, Ron gave as much as he did on it. Post-playing and coaching, Ron continued to promote the growth and development of football. He was an early supporter of the women's game, and to the end, he was a staunch supporter of Melbourne's coterie group, who in 1941 had pledged to support Ron and his mother, Elsa, after the death of Ron Sr. As the Premier said, anyone who knew Ron has a special memory of him. Mine is right here at the MCG, carrying our 2021 Premiership Cup off this field with Ron after we unfurled our 13th Premiership flag. Ron said to me, this one took a while, part question, part accusation, I think, and I did smile because Ron was never renowned for understatement. Yes, it did, Ron, 57 years to be exact. Our first since he had captained our club to victory in 1964. And as we raised that flag, I think every Melbourne heart beat a little bit truer, knowing that our Ron was there to see another Melbourne premiership. Today we acknowledge the contribution Ron made. I can wholeheartedly say we are a better football club, a better competition, a better community because of Ron, because of what he stood for and the values by which he staunchly lived. Today we also say goodbye. And when Ron finished as coach of the D's in 1985, a poem was written, and I think the opening lines say it all. Well, Barrass, the time has come to bid a fond farewell. From your mother club, the mighty D's, the team you loved so well. Thank you, Ronald Dale, forever part of our demon spirit, forever keeping a watchful eye on your beloved red and the blue.
Thank you, Kate. And by the way, I am well acquainted with the fact that the other mob had claims on him as well. It's a hard enough day for me as it is without mentioning their name, okay? Legendary player, captain and keeper of the Demon Flame, Gary Lyon.
Thanks, Ed. What a great honour it is to be here today. Ron Barassi will not only be remembered as one of the most significant figures in the history of sport in this country, but he'll also be remembered for being one of the greatest educators this country has seen. It stands to reason that a man who had such a profound impact on the game of Australian rules football, first as a player and captain and then as a coach, would have impacted the lives of so many of us who played or simply followed the game directly or indirectly. I was fortunate to be in both camps. He captured my imagination as a football-obsessed youngster in the country who got no closer to him than via the pictures on our television. And then, as fate would have it, as the coach of my football team, as the selector of my state side, and eventually as a colleague in the media. Never was there a great sense of familiarity or even friendship. I never allowed myself that privilege. Always, however, was there ultimate respect, awe, surrealism, hero worshipping and an unyielding gratefulness that I was in some way blessed to have been the beneficiary of his company and of his knowledge and wisdom. To be able to say I knew Ron Barassi will be enough. It's only fitting then that we all reflect on the lessons from one of the game's great teachers, one of life's great teachers, lessons learned from a life so thoroughly well lived. For those fortunate enough to have watched him play, he was the embodiment of everything that we've come to love, respect and admire in any of the greats that have followed in his footsteps. To talk to those that have played with him and to read the tributes that have flowed in recent weeks, he may just be the greatest competitor to have ever played the game. What a moniker to have associated with your name. Regardless of talent, of physical attributes, of genetic blessings, the competitor is the title that you would love to have the most. He taught us that when everything else deserts us, as long as you are standing, you can compete. Ron Barassi, the ultimate competitor. He taught us that loyalty and commitment is not exclusive to a particular club or organisation, but to the club or organisation that you are loyal and committed to. That to have the strength of your convictions to go down a particular path, the path that is right for you, may be the most difficult decision that you ever have to make. At 72 years of age, if anyone had earned the right to watch the world go by, it was Ron Barassi. Yet on New Year's Eve 2008, while sitting quietly in St Kilda, Ron witnesses a woman being assaulted by a group of thugs. I ask you all, old and young, what would you do? For Ron Barassi, there is no question. He jumps out of his seat, he comes to the aid of the woman, tackling the men in the process. He's set upon by the men and suffers facial bruising, sore ribs and an arm injury. The lady in question has a swollen face and black eyes, and in the report that I read, it quoted her as saying, "I think if he hadn't jumped in, it would have been much worse for me." How many people throughout his time on this earth are grateful that Ron was the type of man that never hesitated to jump in? Ron Barassi, educator, ultimate competitor, inspirational leader, respect builder, with the strength of his convictions that few possess, and a defender of us all. We'll miss you, Brass. Thank you.
Beautifully said, Gary. Laurie Kerr was a former Carlton player and power broker of this town. He wanted Barassi to pull the Blues out of their lowest ever ladder finish at the end of the 1964 season. President George Harris made Barassi an offer he couldn't refuse. And the biggest story in football was on. The Carlton years, narrated by his flamboyant, brilliant, match-winning superstar and phone chess opponent, Brent Croswell.
Today it became known that Melbourne champion Ron Barassi is an applicant for the position of playing coach. Where is your heart, Ron? Right here, Ron.
You want to know about Barassi? Let me give you an insight, okay? Barassi came to the rooms at half-time near mad. He was seething with frustration and anger. He kicked the lock off its hinges, turned and smashed a silver jug full of cordial from a table. It could have broken his arm. The cordial had sprayed over the faces of 3 prominent Carlton committeemen standing nearby. They didn't move a muscle. He stormed around the room menacingly and no one dared catch his eye. If we were going badly, we knew not to be the first in the huddle at quarter time, nor up the race at half time. Let the mugs run in first, we thought, and cop a Barassi blast. I learned fast. Head to the bathroom, lock the toilet door, come out when Barassi started to feel like he needed to say something positive. That was my mantra.
Ball picks up, hand passes to Barassi. Barassi hooks it in. He shapes up, he shoots for an acute angle. Oh, remarkable.
Barassi drove Carlton with a frightening, violent fierceness in those early years.
Oh, glorious mark taken by Ronald Dale Barassi.
His competitive drive was almost pathological, and on the field as a player.
Oh, Barassi towned him.
And as a coach, he was a force of nature. And this with his other martial attributes, his bull neck, his massive chest, his long muscular arms and his powerful thighs, a body that needed no building up in the gym. His courage made him indomitable.
Oh, look at that Barassi.
He was a player for the ages, a coaching powerhouse for the times.
The siren's gone, has it yet?
In 1968, with Barassi as coach, Carlton broke a 20-year drought when they beat Essendon in the grand final.
Well done.
But these achievements were a mere prelude to the greatest triumph, the 1970 grand final victory over Collingwood.
Cut them on his own.
Not a bad player to leave alone, is he?
Oh, you kidding?
Wouldn't Barassi be tearing his hair out? Collingwood well in command at this stage. It's a fair way out, and he's on an angle, but he puts this on its way.
At half-time in that astonishing game, we were nearly 8 goals down. But when we walked in, we expected a Barassi tirade, but no. To our amazement, he was quite calm and considered, and he had a strategy. He urged us to play on at all costs, to handball. This was revolutionary. In the second half, we began to get back in the match, and then, incredibly, in the last minutes of the game, we hit the front and we held on. We had won.
It's all over. Carlton got up in the dying stages. Fantastic comeback. They were gone to the world at half-time.
It seemed a miracle at the time, and Barassi had played a masterful role. He had anticipated the more frenetic handball-crazed modern game. The origins of his powerful football personality, his almost maniacal drive to compete, will always be a source of wonder to me. It is fitting, then, that Barassi, this great football figure, should be remembered in this vast stadium, the MCG, where he began to make his name. Keep our memories of him here on the field of battle, because domestic surroundings would only diminish him. How could it be otherwise? He had achieved such a consummation in football. We go back a long way, Barassi and I. This was 1967 when he drove down to my Tasmanian country town seeking a recruit, wearing a blue suit, as I remember. His passing is so very, very sad.
Thank you, Tiger. At North, it was Alan Aylett, Albert Mantello and Ron Joseph who famously signed Barassi to a contract on the back of a napkin at the old Melbourne Motor Inn. The 10-year rule, colour TV and a first ever premiership as the Roos went from being poor old North to the most glamorous team in the game. Croswell came for the ride with Barassi and linked up with another brilliant match-winning superstar, Sam Kerkovich.
North Melbourne. Bottom of the Victorian Football League last year, the only club never to win a grand final, and with a new administration determined to change that in the next 3 years.
Well, here we are back at Arden Street. How do I feel? I'll be implicitly candid with you. I feel a bit eerie. I still have visions of this intimidating sight. Florid with rage, eyes bulging, blood vessels protruding from his face, nostrils flared, delivering a tirade of invective and unbridled abuse that would leave you in a catatonic state.
They're not going to have the bloody forward line do well, and that bloody back line play. This is too big a match, and too much money at stake for their bloody be like that. You done that typical bloody thing. You weren't anywhere near that bloke. They're playing 4 yards from him.
But he was the master psychologist. He knew exactly how many buttons he could press on an individual and how to best extract the performance from him. You knew when he was in the room, and God, he was larger than life, a behemoth of a person. But there's 2 words that best depict the spirit and the essence of the Australian character, and they are fair dinkum. And there's no one more fair dinkum than Ron Barassi.
Barassi has never known failure. And in Melbourne, Aussie Rules and Barassi are interchangeable names.
When he arrived in 72, we were a fledgling club, there's no doubt about that. The level of expectation soared, the disciplines changed, the responses changed. I think the whole language changed.
I mean, North Melbourne, they do things in a really good way, a big way. If you're got courage and you're prepared to commit yourself, we will able to make you a valuable player.
We missed the finals in his initial year, but the foundation was well and truly laid. We played finals for the next 7 years.
I'm extraordinarily proud of you.
75 was an amazing year.
But I want you to make me the proudest coach in league history, Vince.
And there was no way in the world that we were going to lose that grand final.
And I want this crowd to be proud of every last one of you.
Our first ever premiership.
Hey, Mickey, get a couple of pies tonight.
There's Barassi. Look at him. He's cracking it for a smile. Oh, it's a ring-a-ding-ding for North Melbourne, isn't it? North Melbourne's first ever flag.
And it was really the coming of age of the club. It took us 50 years to venture from base camp to the summit.
Barassi, you've got to give him full marks. A marvel.
And all of a sudden, North Melbourne became a very, very respected entity. I'd left midway through 77, but North went on to win another premiership. They were confronted with a 27-point deficit at three-quarter time. Now, in the normal circumstances, 27-point deficit at three-quarter time in the grand finals, like 127 in a home and away game.
And 77 looks like being Magpie's year.
But such the nature of the man, as he always said, the only risk not to be taken is not to take a risk at all. He threw the magnets around, played an attacking mode, which was always his nature, and he was vindicated and proven to be correct. You know, when it was drawn.
And we'll be back here next week. Hey, golly, another draw. What a great performance it was by North Melbourne.
You know, gave them plenty of confidence to know they can come up the following week. And, of course, the rest is history.
There it is. The grand final is all over. What a mighty performance by North Melbourne. What a mighty performance by the Sigma coach, Ron Barassi.
If I could speak to him one more time, I'd say thank you, and I'd probably apologise. Perhaps causing a few grey hairs, but by and large, I have to say thank you, because without your guidance or your tutelage, who knows where I might be today. I think that's what I would say, in a very simple way.
Well done, Kicker. You might apologise for running through Ron at training one night too after you've been sick of being yelled at, but anyway. To the Sydney years and the saving of the national competition, Brownlow medalist and Sydney captain Paul Kelly.
Ron, to me, was an honest man. He was respectful, had a sense of humour, but the biggest thing that I remember of Ron was that he was a competitor, and whatever he was doing, he had to win. He was unwavering in his belief that Australian rules football needed a national competition with a team in Sydney. In 1976, he predicted he would one day coach a Sydney team.
Now get the specs on. Just see what you're like in 76.
A decade from now, I'd like to think I could be coaching a Sydney team in either the VFL, the NFL, or both. Beyond it, we're commonplace to have coaches who are full-time and dragging in up to $30,000 a year. I should have said week there.
17 years later, Ron was proven right. If he hadn't taken over as coach during one of the club's lowest ebbs in the early part of the 1993 season, the Swans might not be here today.
They're a struggling unit, chronically short of both wins and support. And if the AFL doesn't help out with drafting and recruiting concessions, would be the end of the Swans.
Enter Ronald Dale Barassi. While he hadn't coached for almost a decade, Ron's presence would become a beacon of light and hope, guiding the club through one of the darkest periods. It was about respect and connection, two Barassi non-negotiables. Ron's favourite saying was, if it is to be, it is up to me. And he wrote it on the whiteboard, I think the first time he ever walked into the club. And I used that as motivation in my footy days and still use it today. Under his command, Sydney had its first win against his old side, Melbourne, ending a string of 26 consecutive losses.
The Swans have broken the drought, and Ron Barassi, who came up here on a salvage mission, has taken 7 weeks to turn it around.
The fans began to return. The media wanted to tell the story. The Swans players wanted to recommit to the club, and the Swans became a destination club.
That is one of the best wins I've ever played in. Oh, people are just putting this club down all the time. These blokes have got real character, real heart. He's a real bloke.
He had done the job he had intended to do, helping to guarantee the Swans' survival.
We're at a stage now where we can go on, and indeed must go on.
Sydney P. Kelly, 2-0.
Ron was sitting next to me when I won the 1995 Brownlow medal.
I declare Paul Kelly the 1995 Brownlow medal winner.
Ron's influence had certainly contributed to my win. We started to make it happen under Ron, even if he wasn't there for some of the latest spoils. We made the grand final the year after he left as coach, and in 2005, the Sydney Swans won the first club premiership in 72 years.
The longest premiership drought in football history is over!
It makes me smile to think of Ron and Bobby Skilton sitting in the stands that day with tears in their eyes. Barassi, the Swans, and Australian rules footy are forever grateful.
Waiting for the catch, Pip.
Well done, Kels. An AFL pioneer of the national competition, former West Coast Eagles chairman and the hero of the Sydney Swans, their former chairman, Richard Collis.
Thank you. I've been told that I've got a very limited amount of time. Most of the stuff has been covered anyway, but primarily I will try and stick to the time I've been allocated because I don't want to incur the wrath of the MC one more time. Let me open by saying how flattered personally, and we are as a club, to have this honour bestowed on us. But at the same time, from a personal point of view, let me also say I am very overawed to be part of this extraordinary event. In the interview with Lee and Kevin, Eddie raised the Piscean Club, and I just want to depart from the topic briefly. And so you've got to understand, of all the star signs, the Pisceans are seen as wimpish and they're dreamers and they live under trees sort of writing poetry. The four pillars of the Piscean Club were Barassi, Matthews, Kekovich and Neil Curley. So if you'd walked into one of the lunches, I'm not sure you would have understood what the event was all about. First, I think Ron would have been very proud of his Swans captain's reflection. I know he saw a lot of himself in Paul. Ron was formally involved with our club for the best part of 11 seasons, 3 as coach and 8 as a director. Although I have to say there is no record of his retirement having been lodged with ASIC, and ASIC have no record of it either. So on that basis, he may well be the longest-serving club director in AFL history. In addition to our formal relationship, I was so grateful to develop an enduring 30-year friendship with Ron and Cheryl. Ron's appointment as Swans coach and hand in glove as the major advocate of the game in the northern markets, where, incidentally, 52% of Australians reside, but particularly in Sydney, will, I believe, progressively be recognised as the most pivotal moment in the push to create a truly national competition. A decade after the relocation of South Melbourne, Australian football in Sydney was, to be candid, a wasteland. The club and the game were intertwined, and a lack of interest in one impacted detrimentally on the other. Both were seen as the enemy by the 2 rugby codes and other parties of influence in Sydney. Facilities were non-existent. It's often been said, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that Ron's office was a converted broom closet. That actually was very close to the truth. Now, the only thing worse than trying to establish a foothold in a new market than being treated as an intruder is being an object of ridicule. We were both. By 1993, the club, and hence the game, was in a death spiral. A circuit breaker was desperately needed, but from where and by whom? Private ownership hadn't worked. The glitzy approach certainly hadn't worked. What was needed was a solution that involved genuine long-term substance. In the 8 years out of the game, in Ron's opinion, the coach-player relationship dynamic had changed dramatically. And on field, the strategy of coaching a team had changed even more. However, Ron Barassi was still the biggest name in the history of Australian football, and in fact the best known identity across all the football codes in Australia, not just in Melbourne. And as has been mentioned, he envisioned coaching an AFL team in Sydney before it was even contemplated. By his own admission, Ron, however, questioned whether he had the energy and the knowledge of the contemporary game to, at 57, coach again. So I think, given what was at stake, he would have asked himself the question, if not me, then who? So what unfolded? In 1993, Ron won 1 game out of 16, a 6% winning ratio. 94, it climbed to 18%, and in 95, it was 36%, and the club had a percentage of 100. In 1996, the team that Rodney Eade largely inherited from Ron, and I'm not in any way diminishing Rodney's achievements, had a 74% win ratio, finished on top of the ladder, and played in its first grand final in 51 years. Now that's what I call a trend, and the following is what I would call a legacy. In the 50 years prior to Ron joining the club, we played in a miserable 6 finals games. We lost them all. 5 of them we were belted in. In the 25 years post Ron's involvement, the club has played in 50 finals and had 25 victories, including 7 grand finals resulting in 2 premierships. Now, no one at the club thinks that we are masters of the universe and that's the most extraordinary thing that's happened. But there is now clarity and a sense of purpose within the club that wasn't there for half a century, and it has progressively found that quality substance. The 3 longest-serving coaches in our history are the 3 that succeeded Ron, and 9 of the 10 Swans games record holders have or are still playing in the post-Barassi era. Tellingly, the game in Sydney is taken more seriously. But to those who have an influence over the national competition, trust me, there is still much to do to fulfil Ron's vision. In closing, I want to say it is one of the greatest privileges of my life to get to know Ron and to work so closely with him. And I can say unashamedly that I respected him greatly, but more importantly, I loved him. Farewell, great man.
Thank you, Richard. And, well, something's coming out of this that might just lift my spirits a little bit at the moment. Andrew Dillon, I think we need to have a retrospective inquiry into the recruiting laws back in the 50s of Melbourne and Carlton. And the good news and the lead out of today is that the Swans will be now investigated by ATSIC over breaches of the Directors and Companies Code. So something there. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying it. We're coming to the conclusion of our memorial service today. As you can see, we're just setting the set here right now because it's time to stand up. Everybody, if you can stand up, come and have a stretch because we're going to do something special here. And who better to come on stage than the voice of football himself, Mike Brady.
There it is. Well, you work to earn a living, but on weekends comes a time you can do whatever turns you on. Go out and clear your mind. Me, I like football, and there's a lot of things around. But when you line them up together, the footy wins hands down. Up there, 'cause I live in there and fight. Out there and Adam, show them you might. Up there, 'cause I live, don't let them in. Fly like an angel, you're out there to win. There's a lot more things to football than really meets the eye. There are days when you could give it up. There are days when you could fly. Well, you either love or hate it, depending on the score. But when your team run out or they kick a goal, holds the mighty roar. Oh, here we go. 2, 3, 4. Out there, 'cause I in there and fight. Out there and Adam, show them your might. Out there, 'cause I don't let them in. Fly like an angel, you're out there to win. Out there, 'cause you're out there to win. In there and Adam, don't let them in. Out there, 'cause show them your hide. Fight like the devil, the crowd's on your side. Out there, Barassi, in there and fight. Out there and Adam, show them your might. And up there, 'cause and Barassi too. We love you, number 31. We'll never forget you. We'll never forget you.
As a person who was basically honest, enthusiastic and gave it his best shot, that's what I'd like to be remembered as.
If Australian football is a religion, then my next guest is its high priest.
No man has contributed more to the changing facade of football than Ronald Dale Barassi.
The man once described as being to Australian rules football what Herb Elliott was to middle distance running and Muhammad Ali to boxing.
Ron Barassi was a cross between Don Bradman, Elvis Presley and Michael Jordan.
Right through, Shane.
He was always trying to lift the bar. He was always trying to get you thinking. He was always challenging you. But what you knew about Ron Barassi is off the field, he really loved you and wanted you to become the best person and player you could be.
What is, in fact, the secret of motivating people?
Fear is one, challenge is another, pride is one, love is one. A good coach uses them all. Motivation really out in the field must become self-motivation. The best coach in the world on individual technique is yourself.
It isn't what you achieve, it's what you should achieve with what you have. I'd like to thank my mother and my father for putting me on this planet with the right set of genes, in the right place, at the right time.
I just grew up in football. I was of football blood with my father having played the game at the highest level. A favoured son at the Melbourne Footy Club, but he was killed in the war in Trabuc. When we found the grave, I spoke to him.
And then this was Barassi putting his iron will on the line, tackling the gruelling Kokoda Trail as a birthday bash.
These sort of things remind me of it. It makes you sad, but I'm very proud.
There's never going to be another Ron Barassi.
Ronald Dale Barassi carried more than just a tangible torch.
Extremely honest, extremely fair.
He's the most humble, gracious, modest man you'd ever meet.
In a country with very few heroes and leader images, Ron certainly provides one, there's no question of that.
Melbourne's most recognisable face striding down the Yarra River. To his legion of fans, nothing out of the ordinary. It was often said that Ron Barassi could walk on water.
Ron gave as much as he could to everyone in the community.
Ron Barassi is a legend, but he's legend with a capital L.
He was a great player, without exception, the most successful coach of recent years.
The football champion became elevated to legend status by the Sport Australia Hall of Fame.
There is a spirit in sports people, and I hope I've lived up to that.
Well, it's just my approach. It's not right, it's not wrong. It's just me.
Barassi was a hero to a young Neil Mitchell. They would become great friends and colleagues. Please welcome legendary broadcaster on 3AW and the wearer of number 31 on his schoolboy Guernsey, Neil Mitchell and friends.
Thanks, Ed. The coach would be very pleased, a Collingwood man handing over to a Melbourne man. I think it would be fair to say that there could have been any one of thousands of people up here today. That's how Ron could collect friends. Everybody he met was a friend. They were there to have their brain picked. He was one of the most curious men I ever knew, inquisitive, naturally inquisitive. We all feel very honoured to be here representing his friends. And Ron was about much more than football. He was a positive symbol and a force in life and football. Media was a huge part of his life. We'll get to that later. First, the man who knew Ron longer than anybody, 75 years in fact, from Preston Tech days through to coaching. On my left, Noel Carey. Advertising guru, long-time urger and mate, Bill Shannon, and America's Cup legend, John Bertrand. Ron always said he won the Cup for John. Both these two with Ron were members of that extraordinary group. Once were warriors. They took on the world. John Bertrand, let's start with you, because people tend to forget Ron was a very powerful motivational speaker. 1980, he came over to America to motivate a bunch of yachties. How did he do it? How did it go? What did he do?
Well, he had no idea why he was in America talking to us. You know, the concept of the America's Cup was so out in left field, but he was there to talk to an Australian team, and the trip was sponsored, I assume, by Mars bars.
Yes.
And he arrived with a captain's hat with a Mars bar on the top of it. Like, it looked ridiculous, and it was just fantastic. And I remember the great man, he came in and assembled the team. So this is 3 years, Neil, before we won the America's Cup. This was the 1980 America's Cup Challenge. And he came in, and I remember sitting down literally the front row and listening to the great man. And he was talking about Thames Street, which is the main street of Newport, Rhode Island in America, which is where the competition was being held. And he said, now, boys, you walk down the main street holding your head high. You are Australians, you are Australian athletes, you are representing our country. Never forget that. And that's kind of how he started off. And his speech went for, I don't know how long, but 15, 20 minutes. He didn't miss a beat, and you felt like you could walk on water as a result of the great man. It's the first time I'd ever met him. And as it turns out, we became lifelong friends thereafter.
Well, Bill Shannon, also a lifelong friend, be very surprised to hear he's a dedicated soccer man, which Ron managed to forgive, but he never had a great understanding of Australian football until he went looking for a football icon in this country as an advertising campaign. Just take a look at what resulted from that.
There's been a lot of speculation about Ron Barassi joining a new team. Now I'd like to have my say. I have. It's a team that knows that the key to winning is giving it everything you've got. That's the only way you'll win self-respect and the respect of those around you. I've just joined the Hertz team because they've won my respect. There's a new winning attitude at the Hertz Rent-A-Car Company. They've won me, now they're out to win you.
Well, Bill Shannon, you searched the country to find him. How did that happen?
Yes, Neil, it's an interesting story.
Nice and close, Billy.
And it all started, I was with an advertising agency in New York, and one of our largest clients was Hertz Rent-A-Car. And the spokesperson in those days was O.J. Simpson. Now, this is well and truly before he fell from grace. He was the biggest name in football in the US. So when we started the company in Australia, it was my job to find the biggest name in football in this country. It wasn't difficult. We did a little bit of research in all the states, and the one name that continued to be on top, even in rugby states, was Ron Barassi. I actually think we put an end to the idea there was a Barassi line.
Noel Carey, you've known him longer than any of us, 75 years, 12 years old, you met at Preston Tech. Ron told me in later years he was a superb cross-country runner. True?
That's very true, Neil. The year is 1948. Ron had come down from Castlemaine Tech. I'd come across from Pender's Groves Central School. And when we started to think about the year, and I met him, he said, Kerry, in this first event that's coming up for the year, which is the cross-country run, you and I are going into that cross-country run and we're going to win it. I said, oh, that sounds pretty good to me, Ron, but how's that going to happen? He said, well, first of all, we're going to start training. And we train from tomorrow onwards and I'll be at your place. I said, oh, thank you. He was. We went down to the local Desheen Reserve. He did about 50 laps. I did about 5. We got back home. We did it again and again and again for a month. The event turns up, and of course, the inevitable occurs. Barassi comes in at number 1, and I came in at about 121. So that wasn't the end of it, because there was that was the first time that actually happened, but a year later, a similar sort of thing happened, but I got wise then. I didn't need to train like he did. But one of the things he always did to indicate to me that if you're going to be in one of these events, keep your belly clear of water. Don't have a drink. So that was good advice. May have been useful to him, but useless to me.
Be a few players sitting in the stand now would be a bit scared by that prospect. One of the extraordinary things, and again, we all talked to him about this, was at, age 70, walking Kokoda, and how important that was for him because of his interest in military issues. We've heard about that earlier. John Bertram, you and Bill were both with him. What stays in your mind from that Kokoda walk?
Well, you know, his curiosity. We got a few of the once were not warriors, but warriors. Once were warriors. It's a beautiful concept. A few of them in the audience today and here with us. And
created by Cheryl.
Created by Cheryl, is that right? Okay. Cheryl was everywhere. You know, she talked about not knowing anything about football, but she knew about people and she knew the love of this group, 20 people that were pulled together for Ronnie's 70th birthday. One of our guys, John Wiley, showed me a photo this morning of Ron. He'd climbed up. We'd all got up this particular stage halfway through the Kokoda track. It's not easy, and so Ron was 70 years old. Yep, and he eventually got up, and he was not only exhausted, but he was semi-unconscious, almost froth coming out of his mouth. We thought we had to helicopter him off the mountain.
And he kept going.
Not only kept going, but within 30 seconds he was fully recovered. The man, it's like a cockroach. You couldn't kill him off. It was unbelievable. The man, you know, they talk about heart, and he just kept going and going and going. And we walked the track through Ron's eyes, and Rick Burr, who then became Chief of Army, endeavouring to understand these 18 and 19-year-old kids who were fighting the Japanese way back then. But Ron was obviously fascinated with this whole part of our country's history.
And he talked a lot about it when he came back. Now, Bill, you're at Kokoda, but you also travelled the world a lot with Ron. He once described you to me as a difficult little blighter. You spent a fair bit of time in debate with Ron, which is what he loved doing. You didn't let him drive, did you?
Well, I did. We did drive together, and I wouldn't want to do that again. Well, I wouldn't mind doing it again if Ron was around. Of course, I would do it with him. However, in this particular case, we were driving around Greece and Italy. We'd been on the road quite a bit, and we were driving from the Amalfi coast over to Brindisi, which is the northeast of Italy. We'd been on the road about 8 hours. We'd had a few stops. And if anyone who's ever driven with Ron will understand, Ron only knows 2 speeds, stop and flat out. And we'd had a few arguments along the way, or debates along the way. By the time we got to Brindisi, Ron was very tired and very, very angry.
Grumpy.
So we pulled into a little car park, and I suggested that he'd take a rest, and I really just wanted to get out of his any company, really, because he was in such a shitty mood. And I'll go off and try and find a hotel for us. So I was away about an hour and a half, got back, woke him up. He was like a bear with a sore head. I said, I found a hotel, but we need to drive down this very narrow street, so you have to be careful, Ron. So we got to the street, and after everything I said, he just put his foot flat. We're tearing down this narrow street, and I'm beginning to get worried because it was a left-hand drive, so I'm on the other side, and the wall is very close to my window. I kept saying to him, Ron, you're driving too close. Ron, you're driving too close. He completely ignored me, just kept going. Ron, you're driving too close. Ron, you're driving too close. Suddenly there's a whack, and the rear vision mirror on my side got whacked by the wall, or the wall whacked it, and we stopped. We both got out to look over the damage, and I thought, I've got you now. You can't get out of this one. So I turned to him and I said, Ron, I told you you were driving too close. And I was feeling pretty good with myself in saying this. And he came right up to me, shoved his face to my face and says, for bloody hell, he said, don't tell me I'm driving too close. Tell me I'm going to bloody hit something. Suddenly, it was my fault. Unrepentant was Ron.
Noel Carey, just quickly, one thing I'd like, because you're a maths teacher, maths was your life, can you explain to somebody who bombed out in Year 10 maths how you and Ron conspired to work out geometry at the Carlton Footy Club and how you could score goals?
Ron always, at school, had a very keen interest in geometry. As a matter of fact, a guy by the name of Dick Telford was one of his teachers, and Dick and Ron had lots of arguments about geometrical proofs. Anyway, when Ron went to Carlton, he knew that I was a very keen Carlton fan, and I was very pleased when he went to Carlton. One night we were talking, and he said to me, I'm very displeased about the way the forwards are moving the ball into the goal. He said, what I'd like you to do is to have a think about this and work out the best way that I can coach this team to get the best opportunity when the ball hits the forward line. So I said, next Wednesday night, come over and bring some butcher's paper with you and a black marker. And that's exactly what happened. So on the dining room table, we actually set up a little, it was like a graph. It had the two goal posts and the point posts, and it showed clearly the arcs coming away from the centre of the posts.
What was this telling you, the best place to kick from?
Well, the best place to kick from was where you had lines coming out from the goal, and where these lines intersected the curves coming away from the goal mouth.
Yeah.
There were points there of intersection which were very clearly indicated as being the best position to kick from. The worst position would be on the boundary from 50 metres out, and the best would be 5 metres out directly in front.
Well, there's his innovative nature, isn't it? That's really what that is about. We're running very short of time. Bill, you have a message to read from a very close friend. 40 years she worked with him, Rosemary Long. Heaven knows how Rosemary put up with it for 40 years, but she can't be with us on the stage. In fact, she went and came back a few times. The message.
Yeah, look, it's a shame that Rosemary can't be with us, but she was, as you said, spent a long time with Ron, knew Ron probably better than anyone, other than Cheryl. And she says, Ron is a combination of General Patton and the captain of the Starship Enterprise, boldly going where no one's gone before and expecting you to make it so. His infectious enthusiasm attracted a unique set of people into his orbit who remained friends for life. And I am one of them, says Rosemary. And Rosemary knows Ron.
Just finally, gents, to wrap up, 1 or 2 word description, the Ron Barassi you knew. John Bertrand?
Well, we've heard how competitive he was over his lifetime of sport, and his ability to bring people along, but he was also, he had a beautiful sense of humour.
Okay.
You know, and he walked past and he'd pinch you on the bottom.
Terrific.
You always knew it was Ronnie. And
He'd be cancelled.
Yeah, Ronnie was there and he'd pinch you, and then you'd try and shake his hand, and he'd reach out and he'd pull his hand straight back. So he's always tricking you. It's a beautiful man, a beautiful sense of humour, and a beautiful human being.
If that's how you describe 2 words, I wish you were my bank manager. Bill Shannon.
He pinched John. He actually pulled the hairs of my leg. I think where he got that from.
2 words.
2 words.
3.
Curious, wonderful curiosity. But there was something about Ron that I think all of us close to him knew. He really cared for those around him.
Noel Carey, you can count.
Loyalty is the word that I described for a friendship that existed for 75 years. In that year of 1948, I never ever thought that I would witness the greatest show on earth. And it's just been an amazing time for me. And in the words of the song, My Way, it always goes this way. Ron was number 1, top of the heap.
Well said. Well said. Gentlemen, well done. I did promise a word about Ron in the media, because he spent a lot of time in the media. Remember, he started teaching kids how to drop kick when he was in the 50s, wearing his Victorian Guernsey. Sun News Pictorial, Channel 7, The Truth newspaper, and that'd be cancelled now too. He and Lou Richards. 3AW was his home, and he sat with legends, Harry Beitzel, Rex Hunt, Sam Newman, Bill Jacobs, Clinton Gribus, legends of broadcasting. And you'd be very surprised to know there are quite a few egos in that box. But they always bowed to Ron. Ron had the authority even with that lot. He was the god of football to them. To me, and I'll take a few more than 2 words, Ron was intense, inquisitive, much more than a football man. He was a man of the people and a symbol of decency. You had lunch with Ron, you felt wiped out, hour after hour of cross-examination. You'd say something, the sky's blue. And he'd say, well, why? Prove it. What do you know? And sometimes it's grey. Determined, focused, generous, compassionate, funny, a visionary. He was a symbol of what is decent in this country, inherent decency. Ted Whitten, I think Eddie mentioned earlier, Mr. Football, called him Mrs. Football. Ron didn't like that very much. But to me, he was more than Mr. or Mrs. Football. He was Captain Decency. He showed us how to do it. He showed us what we could be and what we should be. Captain Decency. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's time to hear from more people who knew Ron as they pay their respects.
Ron, I grew up with you in Melbourne when you were playing at your peak, and then served with you on the Sport Australia Hall of Fame board for many years. I, like millions, admired you as a sportsman of integrity, a champion, and a bloody legend. Your toughness and fighting spirit, whilst unmatched on and off the field, was balanced by a love of Aussie rules, a love of sport, and a love of your fellow man, and always an obligation and a commitment to give back. Rest in peace, my friend, my inspiration.
I was called in by Ron to write his story, and what an honour that was. I remember somebody saying to me, God, mate, that's like writing the New Testament. And it was. He was a self-effacing man. You had to go to everybody else in his life to ask them about Ron Barassi. He had no grand ego. He wasn't full of tales of what he'd done in the past. He always had his eyes on the future. Ron was a man who looked ahead. He never looked backwards. He left an impenetrable mark on the game. He left the game in a better state. He left every club in a better state than where he'd found it. So we're forever indebted as Australian rules football fans to Ron Barassi.
What was very impressive about Ron was that he was a legend of the game, a legend of sport all round, and just such a good and humble man. And that's very special. My condolences to all the family. What a loss it must be for Ron, but you can all rest in the certainty that he was a very special man who'll be held in the highest esteem by all those who came across him from all walks of life. He treated everyone the same, and his legacy will live on in Australian sport and globally for a long, long time.
The two great Australians I've known in my life have been Sir Weary Dunlop and Ron Barassi, and they epitomise what this country is. Ron was larger than life. He was the doyen of modern football. He was revered. He was taken. His credibility was beyond reproach. He was a tough, brimstone, fiery orator when he coached, but off the ground he was a charming, pleasant, decent man. And of course the whole of Australia will miss Ron because he was nationally known, but certainly the football public will remember him with great joy forever.
Thanks, Sam. And finally, former Victorian Premier and the Chairman of the MCG Trust, the Honourable Steve Bracks.
Thank you, Eddie. Friends, as we have heard, Ronald Dale Barassi's contribution to our great game extended beyond his remarkable feats of dexterity and endurance on the football field. He championed the recruitment of Indigenous players and Indigenous rights. He championed the radical idea of pushing the Barassi line north into rugby territory and making the dream of Australian Football League a reality. He championed the development of a women's football league, and he initiated the highly successful Irish experiment. His AFL record, however, was not perfect. He never played or coached for Geelong. Friends, in addition to his football and coaching brilliance, as those who had the privilege of knowing him will attest, Ron Barassi will also be remembered for his insatiable curiosity. Ron was always questioning, exploring new ideas, wanting to experience new things, hence the Kokoda track at the age of 70, sailing in the Hamilton Island and cycling in Mongolia, of all places. Another of Ron's memorable traits was his competitiveness that extended well beyond the football field. Ask anyone brave enough to sit down with Ron to a game of chess, or join him in a round of golf, or take him on a table tennis. I remember a weekend when my teenage kids and I went bushwalking with Ron in the Otways. We all struggled to keep up. Ron liked to win. He liked to win and he liked to laugh. He didn't hesitate when we asked him if he'd mind getting his feet wet during the baton handover for the 2006 Commonwealth Games. He was delighted to get to walk on water, to walk on the Yarra River. And as we have heard, he was brave, putting his life at risk to defend a woman being attacked in St Kilda on New Year's Eve. Ron Barassi was a decent, honourable man. He was a boy from Castlemaine of Swiss-Italian heritage, who grew into a legend of Australian rules football, who became so well known and loved that his life story was put on the stage. Perhaps it's time to further immortalise him and give him the AFL Premiership, give the AFL Premiership Cup a name, the Barassi Cup. Ron Barassi became a man who would have made his father proud. As we have heard, Ron's dad played for Melbourne before he was killed in Tobruk in World War II when Ron was just 5. Ron Jr. grew up supported by a village. His widowed mother Elsa, his uncle Alan, his grandfather Giuseppe, Aunt May, legacy and the Melbourne Football Club, there most notably the great Norm Smith. Ronald Dale Barassi rose to become one of the most well-known and respected personalities in Melbourne, the city he made his home. He would have loved this event here at the MCG, the venue for many of his greatest football moments. His only regret, I'm sure, and ours, is that he's not here to celebrate it with us. Condolences to Cheryl and the family. Vale, Ron Barassi.
Thanks, Braxy. And maybe even the Ron Barassi senior and junior stand. I don't know about that, but looks pretty good from here. Ladies and gentlemen, let us bid farewell to Ronald Dale Barassi. A constant in our life, his memory will endure forever. the personification of all we hold dear in our game of the great Australian rules football. And to the sporting city of Melbourne and the mighty Big V of Victoria, a man who, as much as anyone, understood sacrifice, the enthusiasm of high achievement, the never say die ethos, courage and teamwork, brilliance and skill, and who looked forward and not back and made our world a better place by pure force of personality and presence. On behalf of the State of Victoria, thank you all for being here today. It's been wonderful. "17 grand finals for 10 premierships, his famous flourish of 17 for 10, it adds up to 31. And as Melbourne members would say, number 31 will never forget you. Thanks for everything, Barassi. And to close this special day, Cheryl really hoped that Kate Sobrano would be able to sing this song. It speaks for her and all the people who loved the great Ron Barassi. Valet, pal.
Some say love, it is a river that drowns the tender reed. Some say love, it is a razor that leaves your soul to bleed. Some say love, it is a hunger, an endless aching need. Well, I say love, it is a flower, and you, it's only seed. It's a heart afraid of breaking that never learns to dance. It's a dream afraid of waking that never takes the chance. It's a taken, who cannot seem to give, and the soul afraid of dying that never learns to live. When the night has been too lonely and the road has been too long, and you think that love is only for the lucky and the strong, just remember in the winter, far beneath the bitter snows, lies a seed, and with the sun's love in the spring becomes the rose.
I think my footy life could be summed up like this. I've swanned around a bit. I've made a few blues. I've hopped into life like a demon. But that's me. I like football. Thank you.